Carlos, I'm going to make you lose this argument, and it might be played back in the future. But the best engineer I've ever had has been an Australian engineer who came over and said, I want to become a QS. They knew the steelwork drawings inside out, and they could argue totally against the supply chain, totally against the contractor, the client, because they knew the drawings. They knew, and I've not known a QS to have that level of detail. Shout out to Lynette Shackles in Australia, back in Australia, because she absolutely smashed it. But she had that knowledge. I've not known the QSs on the major projects that have that.
Welcome back to the Offsite Podcast, episode 102 today. And we're diving into something that is super interesting to me. And I guess it's either fundamental to how projects work, or maybe at the other end of the spectrum, completely unnecessary, depending on your perspective. And that's the role of quantity surveyors and commercial teams in major construction projects. And there's a lot of difference in how that model operates in different parts of the world or different sectors. So to have this conversation in a educated and qualified way, I'm going to be joined, as per usual, by Carlos Cavallo, famously a quantity surveyor in a former life. Thomas Schultz, joining us again from the AFEX team, who would argue he's a project manager and engineer, but once a QS, always a QS. And then the real brains of the operation, Peter Fitzpatrick, Project Commercial Director. Thank you very much for taking the time to have the conversation.
No, that's all right. Thanks for having me. I'm probably the only real one out of the three.
That's actually true, though.
That is true. That hurts because it is true. Yeah.
We'd have such a terrible conversation if you weren't here, because it's just two ex-QSs and an engineer.
That means three people that are not good QSs, basically. Is that the...
Yeah. There you go.
I think there's a lot to cover and there's a lot of depth to the conversation. So maybe we just cut the banter, dive straight in, and maybe just to set the scene, Carlos, if I go to you, if you from your perspective, and if you've got a good enough long-term memory, can you describe what a quantity surveyor does on a major project?
Is this like one of those awful wedding speeches when you open up with what the definition of love is and you go to the RICS and read out the first line?
That's funny because someone literally did that in a wedding.
Hopefully they don't listen to this podcast. Yeah, if we think about the quantity surveyor is ultimately looking after the commercial interests of a project, right? And then you kind of got this typical traditional quantity surveyor role, which maybe you were taught at university and maybe is sort of standard on a smaller project, but it's pretty much everything from forming contracts, procuring contracts, managing those organizations through the life of their contract, everything from sort of commercial or cost forecasting, notices, variations. So you're kind of administering the contract from beginning to end. But I guess from a major project point of view, our background is sort of high-speed 2, Crossrail, that sort of contract.
Sure.
It's very, very heavily skewed towards contract administration, notices, variations, rather than actual cost control, which I think I personally saw a lot less of. It was kind of this once a month exercise where you pull together a forecast rather than it being sort of front of head every day, the thing that you're actually thinking about. Most of the time was looking at upstream, downstream compensation events or variations and making sure that you're getting your notices in on time and administering the contract, basically. I think that's the exact summary.
All right, now, Peter, as a test, what does a QS actually do? Well,
you know what? Surprisingly, Carlos did tick off most of the items. I saw even on ChatGPT looking at it. I probably say there's a lot more reporting. I think you alluded to it being almost reporting once a month. Whereas I feel on major projects, especially like HS2, you are in a massive reporting cycle. That by the time you finish reporting in 1 month, you're into the next month on reporting, and that's reporting to the client and reporting internally to your business. So you're in this continuous cycle of reporting, outside of which, you do the variations and all that good stuff that Carlos just mentioned.
In different markets or different parts of the world, that set of responsibilities gets kind of distributed differently to different people on the team. Thomas, if you can remember back to when you were not a quantity surveyor, and maybe back in Australia as an example, and I know in different parts of North America this is similar. Where does that set of responsibilities typically actually live.
My memory's not that bad, Jace. I do remember being an engineer. And I
Well,
do
that's good. That makes
really
one of us.
Yeah, it's really interesting that difference in role set between the QS in the UK and the engineer in Australia. Like in Australia, 100%, I remember raising downstream variations to contracts all the time. That was a pretty regular thing, you know, writing out those scopes of work documents, making sure the financials, the forecast, all that kind of stuff aligned downstream. And you did a lot more cost control, I found, back home as an engineer when you're in charge of your financials in terms of like, you know, your earned value, your cost phasing, all that kind of stuff. Whereas I found on the major projects here in the UK, that wasn't done by the QS, that was done by the cost control team. So there's a whole separate team that sort of does that other bit of responsibility in terms of, you know, financial tracking and cost controls and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of interesting to see. So yeah, pretty big difference in how that role is split up.
Yeah, so you end up kind of, if I was to play back, Thomas, like from, and again, I'm remembering back a lot further than you are, but this like, for want of a better label, this kind of like full stack engineer person who's doing like what you would class as a project manager engineer role, is doing kind of cost forecasting and tracking, and is also doing procurement, right? In Australia, like I've almost never had a separate procurement team.
100%. I mean, there may be procure frameworks, but there'd be zero value contracts and things like that. It'd be up to you to actually develop the scope, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And then even that procurement function, from what you described, Carlos and Peter, that's a separate thing altogether on most major projects in the UK, or do QSs ever dabble in that?
A loose touch on it. So you have a set of procurement professionals who will push the procurement process. But in terms of the high level procurement strategy, a QS will be involved in that and will be checking the contracts and making sure all the right T's and C's are in there. And then the procurement team take that and run with that and do the whole tender process.
Yeah, sound. So I guess if I think through, or we think through pros and cons of those two different approaches, as the engineer that has like forgot to send a notice to a subcontractor like 4 months in a row, I can think of a couple of obvious benefits to specializing in the role. But yeah, I don't know if people have thoughts on like the pros and cons of the specialization versus kind of generalist approach.
Remembering back, two of the probably the most challenging parts as a QS, really understanding not just scope, but progress on site. It makes total sense if you think through a perfect world, having a deep understanding of that makes everything else slightly easier that you're meant to be managing. And also, even if you're procuring a package, the thing that you'll spend a lot of your time getting your head around is to think commercially about a piece of scope. You really need to understand that piece of scope. Otherwise, you're kind of shooting in the dark a bit with the realities of how it's delivered and assessing what subcontractors are claiming the process will be or what they need and the equipment and everything else. So I can see why there's a massive benefit from being an engineer and managing that process, because you're closest to that detail and you probably wouldn't have the wool pulled over your eyes as much as a fresh-faced QS would have. But at the same time, there's no way on a major scheme under NEC you would have engineers with the time to do it. Every engineer we speak to every day is saying they have no time. Engineers should be on site more in the office and are already spending too much time in the office. So if you throw in what is effectively a full-time job on top of their scope, then you would end up just needing twice as many as engineers, because they could only deal with smaller packages of work because they're doing both sides. There's definitely pros for both. My experience is all NEC, and that's definitely not the whole industry and how it operates. So my perception of it is skewed towards something that is admin heavy, which is why it's hard to sort of grasp it.
Yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are, Peter.
I'd agree with Carlos in terms of the engineer has too much on his plate to be able to do it. I think in previous podcasts you guys have talked about the program. It's like, from an engineering point of view, you just about manage to update the program on a monthly basis. I wouldn't want, from a commercial point of view, I wouldn't want to be dropping the ball by not issuing that right notice on time, and then somebody in 2 years' time going, "Oh, hang on a minute, the contract says you didn't issue that notice, so I'm penalising you for X, Y, and Z." So I would want to have a separate team that I know is issuing those notices and getting those notifications in on time. And also, in terms of NEC, it builds up that contemporaneous record. So at least I know in 2 years' time, when there is a dispute, there is a whole load of early warnings that have been raised and maybe responded, maybe not responded to, but there is those records so that you can overcome the dispute. I definitely do think, though, in terms of on major projects, the QS does not have, they don't take the time to get that technical input about what's actually been built. Carlos, I'm going to make you lose this argument, and it might be played back in the future. But the best engineer I've ever had has been an Australian engineer who came over and said, I want to become a QS. They knew the steelwork drawings inside out, and they could argue totally against the supply chain, totally against the contractor, the client, because they knew the drawings. They knew, and I've not known a QS to have that level of detail. Shout out to Lynette Shackles in Australia, back in Australia, because she absolutely smashed it. But she had that knowledge. I've not known the QSs on the major projects that have that. The only thing you get close to it is where they're sat near to each other, where you have your planner, your engineer, your QS all sat in a little huddle together, and they're sat day in, day out, and they're living and breathing that job. And the QS then starts to understand like the engineer, and the engineer starts to understand like the QS. That's where this process that we have in the UK and other places works when they're all together. You put them in two different offices, I guarantee you they won't talk to each other, and the QS will never go on site.
Yeah, this is a great topic, because I think like we've probably all seen examples where the QS kind of is chasing the engineer for info. They're a little bit in the dark. They're maybe a step or so behind. The engineer also on the other side doesn't want to get involved in the commercials in a way I've seen, where they'll kind of like offload everything to a QS. So they'll be talking to a subcontractor, trying to like get them to do something. And that's usually an inherently commercial conversation. The subcontractor has to pull resources or adjust something. And when the engineer is either not wanting to engage in the commercials of that, or maybe intentionally kind of trying to distance themselves, you end up with this disconnect where we're telling them to do something, and, then payment disputes and blah, 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 blah. What's your advice, and how do you, coach junior, QSs? How would you coach young Carlos to bridge that gap?
Difficult question, that is. Coaching Carlos, not just a general question.
That actually did happen as well. Back in the day.
The only thing I can say is just the constant communication between the two. It's going for that breakfast on a Friday and getting to know the person. I'd use the word intimately, but getting to know them inside out and building that relationship where there is that rapport between each other and there's that shared learning. The engineer is learning the why. Why is he constantly being chased by the QS to work out what the additional meter cube the concrete is going to be? Why is that important for the QS? And then also to learn from the engineer as to why the engineer might not be top of their list, or what their workload is, or the priority. Or just physically taking them out and showing them around site and showing how things are actually built. That's what I would say to a junior QS is you can't, especially when you're in your first 3 to 5 years, that's where you learn the most. Once you get grey-haired like me, you struggle more to get that constantly going out on site and understanding the technical nature of everything. It's those informative years, and you keep that with you for the rest of your career.
Would you say start as an engineer? Would you go as far as that, or would you?
I'm not sure. I've been playing this over my mind. Like, I don't think I'd wish that for anybody. No. And also, I wouldn't say start as an engineer because then you've got to do, how many years would you need to do as an engineer? And it's quite a time consuming process to go and get to the same level as a site engineer, which is 2-3 years on site.
Yeah.
Plus you'd have to have all the schooling before that. But I definitely think it should be more than what we do at the moment. I think in terms of when you go to university, you'll learn a module on how to build a house. And it
foundation.
It had to do some foundations and some really basic stuff. Companies have good graduate schemes, and you'll do a week away and you'll do some build a wall out of bricks and blocks or whatever. That's it. Then there's nothing else. There needs to be more to that. And it could be a placement for 6 months or something on site where you just shadow an engineer. It'd be really annoying having a QS just shadow. It might not be different. It might not be any different to what usually happens, is it? It's QS in bright orange shadowing you. But it needs to be something like that where they get that understanding of how construction works.
Yeah, or they could maybe go to Australia for 6 months and then just get put in the deep end.
Set out to the bush. I do think it's quite interesting, the relationship, because there's definitely a case of each side underappreciating the other.
Yeah.
Like construction's very much, you always think your problem's the biggest problem on the project. And I think that's definitely the case of engineers not appreciating what QSs actually have to do, and vice versa. Probably to the more extreme for the engineer, because there's way more. It's kind of a much broader role, which means you really have to master more trades.
You're almost saying more important. I felt like you almost.
But he completely lost my train of thought by saying that. Thanks, mate.
All right, I've got a question for Thomas while you think about it. So
It was actually a
Thomas,
really good point as well.
we
Anyway.
we talked. Okay, we're talking before, Thomas, about like the engineers that might not have the commercial grounding.
Yep.
And I've seen in my own experience this kind of like distancing from the commercial process. Is that something you've witnessed, in your time, maybe in the UK? And is that a pattern that you've seen?
I'd say definitely more in the UK. The engineers
Yep.
keep commercial at arm's length because obviously in Oz, the engineers are ultimately responsible for it. So if it's, not being there, not getting delivered, then yeah, you find out pretty quick when your commercials are behind. But yeah, 100% I'd agree. The engineers in the UK do tend to keep it a little bit more at length of, oh, that's not my problem. But they also play the good cop, bad cop with the PM in that case as well. So that's something you can play in the UK that doesn't necessarily work in Oz, where the good cop and bad cop are necessarily the same person.
We've talked before about from a perspective of like planners where, sometimes you see examples of construction managers or engineers, distancing the planner or distancing a quantity surveyor. And we talked about how like it's probably not best for project and not getting the best outcome. Would you agree that that's like the case, Tom?
Yes and no. Well, yeah, I think, if you're not having that communication, then yeah, I'd say that's probably the worst case scenario. Like when you're deliberately pushing someone away and not giving them the information, then yeah, I think that's fundamentally a flaw. I think there is something to be able to play there when, I'm not going to get involved unless I really need to. And, you have the PM that comes in, bangs the hammer down, bangs the shoe down on the subby, telling them to get back in line. There's definitely that play there, but you still need to have a good amount of communication between and understand the underlying issues before you can do that kind of thing. So I think, if the whole team's just putting it at arm's length, then it doesn't work.
If you think through, like, if you imagine a world where, like, a major scheme that we'd been, like, the ones we were part of, let's assume that, let's take the QS example, and engineers were doing the commercials in their package. I think it's one of those things that would be fine until it's not. And by that, I mean, the simple day-to-day QS sort of routine could be managed by an engineer. But then if you imagine you've got 20 engineers on a project, and then maybe you've just got one or two commercial managers sat above them, which you would probably still have in a world where the engineers manage their own.
Yeah.
It's probably fine until you have major issues. And then you've got this much bigger gap on competency where if you've got a tough problem, the commercial managers would then be in a difficult spot of, okay, now I don't have any QSs to really think and focus about this one thing for the next day, week, month. You can kind of make do until it will be like immediately too difficult, because engineers can't drop everything and just focus on this one commercial matter. That's just unlikely to be the case in terms of, time and responsibility. So you could see it getting by until there's a real problem.
Yeah, I think one thing that I had described to me a number of years ago from like a forensic, like quantity surveyor schedule team was that world where like the construction team run everything in Oz can tend to result in a higher percentage of disputes, and like because it goes the problem might go on longer as opposed to because I can get to a spot where I don't send notices because I'm too busy as an engineer, or things kind of build up, or we might discuss things informally and I forget to send a letter. That whole, there's this argument that says having the team that are going to be as you said, Peter, administering the process can result in fewer disputes. Is that the like North Star of the process? Is probably a good question.
What do you mean? Sorry.
Yeah, said another way, I guess. I can't remember the source of the data, so I'll have to find it and stick it in maybe show notes. But there was research which uncovered that certain markets, specifically I recall Australia being exceptionally high on the list, had a high degree of large projects ending in legal dispute. So going all the way to an arbitrated or a mediated outcome, as opposed to something that gets settled between the two parties. And part of that was put to me was that because there aren't folks administering the contractors consistently.
That could be the case. So I've done a bit of research on this one.
Perfect.
So Arcadis did a report. They did it annually up until about 2022. Don't know why they stopped. And what it said is it had two key areas. is one is the average dispute value and one was the average dispute length. I'll pick out Europe and the UK. So Europe had the average dispute was 57 million US dollars, and the UK was 37 million US dollars. And then the length to resolve that dispute was 17 months in Europe, and it was 11 months in the UK. It's a similar story with North America. The value is closer. So the value was $30 million worth of dispute, and 16 months worth of time to resolve that dispute. So there's probably two things at play in that. It doesn't go into any more detail than that. So there's a 35% difference anyway between Europe. One thing would be adjudication. Someone makes a call on your dispute. It's done within 42 days, can be extended. So that's probably quite a lot at play. But the other part would probably be, and I know we don't like it, but is the NEC contracts, because as much as it's a burden to administer, at least you've got those contemporaneous records, and it's not like a JCT where there's no obligation to talk to each other and say, hang on, there's an early warning for this, or put your notification in for your compensation event. You can just leave it right to the end. And so this world that we're operating in, whilst it's really difficult to administer at the time, the aim of the game is to try and resolve those disputes as quick as possible. So we're not spending loads of money with lawyers as opposed to with quantity surveyors at the time during the job. So I would spend my money on quantity surveyors during the job to stay spending the money on lawyers at the end of the job.
Yeah, I think this is for those that don't know the acronyms, NEC is a form of contract that's popular in the UK, specifically on a lot of infrastructure projects, and JCT is another form of contract that maybe is maybe smaller or build type contract, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't think I've seen any data on this, but I wonder whether anyone has a view on whether this is preventing the dispute and all the legal and the delay in that comes with a cost under, say, an NEC, which is usually resource to administer the contract. The counterparties then also have a set of resource to administer the contract. So the supply chain need quantity surveyors, the client need quantity surveyors. There's almost like an overhead or a cost to avoiding the dispute. And I don't think I've ever seen anyone do any kind of comparative research. So this would be asking a kind of a gut feel view on whether the prevention is worse than the disease or whatever.
But it feels a lot like negligence to just go, let's just all not have quantity surveyors and we'll just hope that we get to the end of there's no major dispute. There's got to be something in it, which is like audit trail, because all of these major schemes that we've referenced in the UK, they're big public funded projects that are under so much scrutiny that if you could just get to the end and you screwed up the project and you did that because you didn't agree anything and you just ignored the contract and got on with it. That seems like a really bad place to be. I'm not sure how the other option is an option without changing the contract. Public scrutiny in this country is so extreme on major projects. Maybe that's one of the biggest drivers for everyone wants to be absolutely bulletproof in their contract admin. And we've always driven that into us, that it's all about getting your noticing in and getting everything in on time. Don't leave any area or opportunity for scrutiny. So I wonder if that's part of it. And maybe there's not a history of these big public overspend projects in some places, which doesn't really drive this need and urgency to have a certain way of working or a certain form of contract. Like it feels like it's not a real option on the other side. But again, based on my UK only experience.
It's different, I think, because obviously in Australia, I don't think it tends to run that way a fair bit. Like I'm thinking about, NEC, very administrative, upstream, downstream notifications, left, right, center. Every week you're raising early warnings, something along those lines. In Oz, obviously, we never really had that kind of, notification period with subcontractors, or at least as the client from my role as the engineer on site. Whether some of the CAs were doing that in the background, potentially, but I don't.
Are any of them just like cost plus fee though? Because then it doesn't really matter if you're just.
There was a lot of incentivized target cost, which obviously does matter then, because then that changes how everything works. Otherwise, there's a lot of cost plus fee, or I haven't seen a very cost plus fee in a very long time.
There's a lot of hard dollar. There's a lot of hard dollar contracts.
So it's if you've
which also doesn't really matter then. Do you know what I mean? Because it's just everything's your risk. Build the job as quick as you can in the most efficient way that you can. Then it doesn't really matter.
Jobs where exactly. So it's your risk. A lot of the contractors in Australia do take on a lot of that risk. Is probably what I would say there.
How much, yeah, I guess what people's thoughts on, I guess some of the idea of NEC is this kind of, I don't know, contractually forcing collaboration between the counterparties in a agreement. I don't know, there seems to be a higher percentage of, let's say, target cost style contracts that in the major infrastructure projects. I can never remember which option that is under NEC. Because I guess my experience from Australia was like contracts that you might look at on face value and say that's not very collaborative, because they'll be typically a hard dollar style contract. But the resulting delivery model is we all just want to get out of this thing as quickly as we can. We sign the contract, we put the contract in the bottom drawer, and we only pull it out if we have a big old falling out. How feasible is contractually forced collaboration, and how much is it culture? I think is the $1 million, probably even more than $1 million question. I'm coming to
You
Peter.
could be in some pretty awkward working environments which are contractually collaborative but absolutely not collaborative. It's contractually collaborative to try and put in place the right sort of processes to facilitate collaboration. Like, you have to have the sort of team who are mutually trying to make the project successful. You need a client that's not just sort of beating down on the contractor. You need a contractor that's fair with the supply chain. There's a lot of things that need to stack up to make a very open and fair project. And a lot of that also does rely on contractors and supply chain looking like they're making money. Back to Peter's point earlier with NEC, that contract's designed that you're commercially agreeing the project as you go. So you know that at the end, suddenly, this massive claims come out of nowhere and everyone's screwed. You're agreeing your defined cost as you go. You're agreeing change as you go, and it's like almost a peace of mind to maintain that culture of open sort of fairness as you're going through it.
Not to call bullshit, but have you ever seen the cost get agreed as you go?
That's NEC 4, which started after we were.
I think if you're on a project where the client, for whatever reason, has got constraints on them, so whether that be money or it's going to be time, I think I'd rather be in a situation where there's something there that I'm in a contract that gives me some form of protection from net. It's not so much say, it's more just a protection to be able to go in the future when there is a dispute, to go, hang on a minute, we were in this collaborative contract and this person didn't play ball. And this isn't just looking up the line, and we use the term of HS2 there, but even down the line with the subcontractors, because they probably they have a harder gig than what we do. So we at least the contractor can team up and not man for man mark, but we can have the right level of resources. You have a subcontractor turnover of 50 million a year, they might have one QS looking after 3 different projects. So they want those teeth as well. So I think I'd rather be in a place where you're potentially going to be in a bad place either way. I'd rather be in there with a contract that at least gives me some protection. So I think I'd like the forced contract collaboration, but then I'm a QS and I love contracts.
Yeah, Peter, is that kind of like contractual obligations in lieu of collaboration is almost what because I think one person described this to me as like, to the degree that you can get your marriage to work by getting written contract agreements of how you'll send each other early warnings when you have a disagreement, it will work. But is it effectively like contractual obligations in lieu of actual collaboration?
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think even though a lot of these major schemes, that the client is still not even the client, they're the client's representative or whoever's been employed to manage that role. It's that marker, that level that's expected from them as well as the general contractor. Imagine a situation where they're just not doing what is expected. If you don't have that in a contract, they can just laugh you out the room. Not to suggest they would, but there's nothing there's no rules to abide by. I think it's protection at both levels, because both should be accountable. It shouldn't just be this downward pressure from the top. There should be expectation and a level of professionalism you expect from above. And if that has to be in a contract so that you can quote that contract, but actually it's a totally unfair environment, I think that's quite important.
From what we've seen, and there is definitely some degree of you need some protection from maybe a totally delinquent counterparty. Even in Australia recently, over the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of contractors walk off of projects. There is some power held by the contractor to, at the end of the day, the client wants the project delivered. What anyone's thoughts are, Thomas, I don't know if you have a thought on this,
I'm trying to think there, because you can think about a few really big jobs in Oz where the contractors, walked off because the original from their perspective that they're completed their side of it as they can, and therefore it's gone. It's an interesting one. I think, to be honest, I quite like NEC. I think the collaborative approach works a little bit. Don't hold it against me, but I did quite like having a standardized contract that the industry somewhat understood. I think is a really good approach versus maybe back home where each head contract is a bit different, different terms from one job to the next. Having everyone on NEC, having that understanding of how it works is actually quite handy.
That I agree. That does. Yeah. Sorry, Peter, go, mate.
No. I think even some of it with the NEC. So when NEC first came out, it introduced early warnings. And then probably about 5 years later, every other contract you looked at was like, yeah, we make an amendment. We're going to put in early warnings as well. So like early warnings wasn't an industry thing. And for every other standard form to have picked it up, it can't be a bad thing. As much as it's annoying when you're in the thick of it, it's like, oh, geez, I've got 10 early warnings coming today that I've got to do 10 meetings next week. All the standard forms have actually gone, do you know what? This is quite a good process. There's some bits that they will pick and choose. The early warnings is one that, so just that there is good bits that have come out of the NEC, which has been adopted across the board.
I bet ChatGPT writes a good early warning these days.
They're not allowed to use it, Carlos.
About that, Carlos.
Sorry, Jason.
I was just going to say this probably was bringing back some flashbacks, and I wondered whether, Peter, you've got any tips here for. I guess a lot of people have probably been in that spot where they've received the early warning from what seems like the keyboard warrior that has written it in a way that you probably wouldn't label as particularly collaborative. Is there anything you do to like coach your team in terms of like how they should write those sorts of documents?
The infamous keyboard warrior that every project has.
Yes.
I think it comes down to, again, trying to understand the individual who's sending them out, trying to understand why are they sending out these what seems menial early warnings, and actually having that discussion with them. If they do keep firing them out, I probably would go and speak to someone above them and go, look, I've got these 5 early warnings. They're not really adding, it's not doing what the process is supposed to be. It's supposed to be, let's have a meeting, let's discuss and see how we can mitigate the impact on cost or time or health and safety or whatever it may be. This person is just giving me pretty much nonsense. And I probably would just escalate it above them and try and see whether you can get it sorted that way. Or it may be that it's systemic to that company who is sending them into you, and then you may have a wider problem. I would probably just then keep going up the chain and going, guys, this is not a good spending of time. We've got bigger issues. We've got bigger fish to fry.
To go round the horn with quite a big question, so I'll let whoever wants to grab this first can, but I'll swing around to everyone. If you could make any change to either like contract structure or the contents of NEC to drive better collaboration in major project delivery, you could think about how the economic incentives works or how some of the mechanics work. What would it be? This is the example of a question that you should send before the podcast, by the way.
Yeah, we're going to pause for 2 minutes while we think.
I would probably put for the program. If you don't submit your first program, you get penalised by 25%. I probably would extend that to the revisions of the program, because that's where the NEC tends to fall down, where somebody doesn't submit a program on a monthly basis, and it's where people don't understand the program about how it's planned completion. You have your planned completion and your completion, and you show your terminal flow and all that good stuff. I probably would encourage people to do that, and it hasn't worked at the moment. Why not? Maybe that's the way forward. I know there's a lot of people who are shouting at the podcast now saying you can't do that.
Yeah, nice.
The one that was always the biggest frustration, not actually getting your defined costs signed off as you went. But am I right in saying, Pete, that the NEC4 allows that to be done on a monthly or quarterly basis through the contract?
It does. It does. How it happens in practice.
With a few caveats.
Well, I just haven't seen it. I haven't seen it in practice yet. Yeah, I'm not on many NEC4 at the moment.
What a lot of these clients would, on a very sporadic or interim basis, go and disallow a load of costs, which completely changes your position. And being very woolly on the labeling and categorization of disallowed costs. So I think having that bedded down and approved on a monthly basis, just like you do a program or something else, feels like a safer place to be, because people are very guarded. You're constantly worrying about your commercial position. And the example of firing notices, if actually we knew each month that, right, what you've spent, and we're not going to put it later, I feel like would be a better place to be. But it sounds like it's slightly improved from back when I did that.
Thomas?
Oh, I would find a way to incentivize the actual agreement of change events a lot faster and quicker. I think that's one of the big things, that some of those CEs can drag out for months and months and months while people discuss.
Escalation, time-bound escalation.
Yeah, like, there's a lot of back and forth that goes on, and the amount of stuff that gets added to CEs, it's not really relevant to that work. And, it's just that whole process, I think, can drag out well beyond what it should. I think of the last project where I think some of the CEs that were open before I arrived are still open and probably still there. So I think there's something that needs to be done in that space. What that solution is, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting how much like the incentivization of things like early warnings and compensation events through NEC drives like a volume problem, which then itself drives the lack of agreeing them, which then so almost goes back to this like this contractually enforced process can sometimes have this unintended consequences.
But then the supply chain don't mind it. So recently, and this is my own bit of study that I've done on this. For a dissertation, so I've just made this stuff up like around in my local area. But I interviewed people from the supply chain, and I thought they would be negative about the amount of change that was coming through and the constant churn of paperwork. And they weren't at all. They were like, do you know what? At least and they were comparing it to JCT. They were like, at least I know where I stand from a financial point of view in terms of what the total cost is looking like. And you try and get bits agreed as you go along, and you'll get a feeling from the employer or the client or the contractor as to where this is going. And they liked that, because on JCT contracts they don't have that at all. And they're like, I'll get to the end of the contract and I won't even know if I'm going to get paid £1 million for that CE or 50k for that CE. And I was surprised by that. I thought the supply chain would be like, man, you guys just constantly beat us up and hammer us with all the clauses and that. Definitely, they've become smart to the NEC. They understand how to administer it, but they weren't against it, which I was surprised with.
Yeah, well, this is probably going to show my ignorance as to what I was going to think about changing, because I was probably in the same boat, Peter. The thing that I observed that I would probably change is maybe some of the mechanics of like an NEC make sense between maybe a principal or a general contractor and a client, but observing, say, the like program acceptance cadence or the early warning cadence that then happens between general contractor and client, and then observing how that then propagates into 14 contract acceptances and early warnings to each of the supply chain. There's like an order of magnitude increase in the admin. I was going to suggest some way of like a simplified, like NEC Lite, for that you can kind of bring the supply chain into it in a way that there's like alignment between contractual positions, but maybe they're more part of the general contractor's delivery team than a totally separate entity. You're lucky if you get as a general contractor, your program accepted, but you know what's happening, which is you're not accepting any of the supply chains programs forever. You're not agreeing any of the CEs so there's this like propagation problem that it feels like we treat a £3 million subcontract the same as a 600 million prime contract.
Yeah.
Another one, which now that we've had 3 minutes to think of this very deep question, is there's lots of forms of contract where you're basically paying a schedule of rates for installing an item or whatever that might be. I've not seen contracts yet where the rate paid per item is increasing with the productivity of the output. So actually incentivizing people to finish earlier. No one really prices that time saving into those calculations to think, actually, how can we be better off as a project? Everyone just wants to hold the end date and pay as little as possible to hit that end date. So
we had a downstream contract there where it was actually, for various volumes of concrete poured. So obviously they get paid more, but it's more efficient for them. So obviously the bigger the volume, the more money they get, but the more efficient it is for them. So that we did actually have a downstream contract that did involve that kind of.
Wow, that's what happens when we get engineers to write contracts. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I think it's functionally, it's not a lot different to, incentivized milestones on, delivering milestones earlier or later. But you don't take the risk that you've incentivized the wrong thing, maybe, Carlos. Because there's plenty of stories of like, you incentivize getting concrete installed.
Quality reduces.
You just get concrete and nothing around the concrete that you assumed you assumed was also going to be built logically.
Yeah.
But
that's true.
Going into my statement of why do we want to finish earlier is that because there's all like one package finishing earlier, but if all the rest of the packages around it aren't, then you've got something that just sat there that you probably then need to maintain. If you take something like a Crossrail project, they want them projects finished bang on time. They don't want them finished 6 months earlier, because then you've got to maintain all of that structure. You've got to look after a load of MEP that's been installed. All the batteries start expiring. You want to finish it on time. You don't want to finish it way too early. So maybe that's the industry that we're working in, where there isn't incentive to, as you say, you guys say from Australia, you want to bust the program. I'd like to just finish on time, and get what I signed up for.
Yeah, well, given the stats around mega projects, I think a lot of people would be happy with on time as well.
Yes, exactly that consistency.
All right, I know we're very much out of time, but thank you very much, everyone, especially to you, Peter, for bringing some smarts to the conversation and taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Jason. Carlos.
Awesome.
Thank you, guys. And thank you very much, everyone, for tuning into today's show. If you did enjoy the episode, please think about liking this video or following us on your chosen podcast platform. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.